Hi, I'm Rory Cremon, and this is my mid-semester assignment presentation. So this is my cover page. So the first question I'm going to look at is, how does the film provide an alternative narrative to deficient-oriented interpretations of black girls in school? So I looked at it and I saw this question as, how does the film show black girls in a positive way instead of seeing them as problems or failures in school? So the film challenges the dominant deficient-oriented narrative that views black girls as inherently disruptive or seen as violent. So I found this quote that I think represents how many school systems unfortunately see black girls. So it says, effectively disciplining black girls for perceived loud and unladylike behavior that challenge their authority. Others have similarly observed that black girls are under greater surveillance of their decorum than their white peers. So I said that this quote shows how schools police black girls' behavior a lot more harsher than their white peers, and it leads to unfair push-out from the schools, which is exactly what this film is about. So what I really liked, the film takes the biases against black girls in school, and it tells a different story. It focuses on the black girls themselves, and their stories show what school calls defiance is often a way of standing up against the disrespect or being ignored in the schools. Speaking up or challenging authority can be a sign of strength, not misbehavior. So, for example, Monique Morris from the film, she explains that when black girls assert themselves, they're protecting their dignity and they're especially protecting their identity. The film shows that schools punish black girls for not fitting white middle class ideas of how a girl should behave. The film also shows how black girls like to express themselves and how they uplift each other through their identity. So that brings us to our next question is, how are their agencies, hopes, desires, collectivity, and resistance presented as a strength in the face of inequality and oppressive systems? So I said that the film shows how black girls claim power and agency through their self-expression. So it's the way they dress, style their hair, their language, and especially the way they stand up for themselves. That's how anyone would stand up for their identity. So many of the girls in Push Out talk about wanting schools where they feel safe, seen, and supported, and they want teachers who listen and understand their experience and ultimately helps them reach their goals of why they're in school. So these desires challenge stereotypes that label black girls as a risk or unmotivated. Instead, the girls show that they are deeply motivated by dreams of success and belonging, even when schools fail to meet their needs. So an example I took that really stuck with me from the film was Samaya, who's on the screen. She's a young girl that spoke on her experience when she was in elementary ed, and she said, "You don't have to let your experiences take you down. Just keep on pushing because it really is going to get better." She's saying that even though black girls face unfair treatment and criminalization, they don't have to let it define them. They can keep moving forward and believe in a better future. And it reflects the film's message that black girls' strength and resistance are powerful responses to the inequality and oppression they face in schools. I like that the film also highlights collective forms of resistance like peer support, mentorship, community programs that celebrate and affirm black girls' identities, and there's also spaces such as restorative justice circles, dance programs, or girl-led advocacy groups model what Monique Morris, as I spoke about before in the film, calls radical hearing, which focuses on culturally affirming practices that build resilience and belonging. So Push Out really does emphasize that resistance is not individual, it's communal. By showing black girls supporting each other and lifting each other up, it creates a positive space, and the film challenges the idea that students alone are responsible for overcoming systematic problems. Instead, it presents resistance as a shared effort to see the new possibilities for education and justice that everyone deserves in the schools. So that leads us to the next question about the film. How does the language used in the film, using push out instead of drop out, reframe how achievement, access, opportunity, and inequality are discussed in education? So I actually really like this question because I think the change on words are so important. So I saw that the film replaces the word dropout with push out because they want to shift responsibility from students to the school institutions. Dropout implies personal failure, and in my opinion, push out highlights how school systems, through discriminatory discipline, polices racialized gender expectations, and it creates environments that exclude black girls. This linguistic change reframes conversations about achievement and opportunity by revealing that inequality is produced by systems of power and not individual behavior. It shows that language itself is a tool of power. So when schools and policymakers use terms like drop out, they maintain control over the narrative. But when students and advocates use push out, they reclaim their right to name their own experiences and expose the institutional injustice that they're facing. So this actually goes back to Samaya, as I talked about before from the film. She explains a specific situation that occurred to her. So I took her exact quote from the film. It says, "My teacher got super duper mad and dragged me by the chair. Yelled at the other kids to move while she was dragging me. Samaya had just gotten a typical argument with her teacher, and it resulted in her being pulled out by her chair to sit outside the classroom. Any student in the class could have done what Samaya did. It was just a typical reaction as a student in the classroom." So then I also liked to look at what her parents said in the film. Her parents used the quote that they had a blind trust. Samaya's parents said they had a blind trust with the teacher, and Samaya's story can be an example of a push-out, not a dropout. Her actions were no different than any other 7-year-old at the time, and instead she got penalized because of her race. This exact situation goes hand in hand with what we learned in the lecture. So I took this quote from our lecture on week 5. It says, "Black girls are immediately positioned as less feminine. Our analysis suggests black girls have limited access to normative femininity, including notions of ability and innocence due to the intersecting impacts of racism and sexism." So I saw this as labeling black girls as less feminine or less innocent helps schools justify pushing them out rather than supporting them. They're taking the way they look and claiming that they can't be seen as innocent and instead that they're just violent. Using the term push-out highlights how systematic racism and sexism, not the girls' abilities or choices, limits their opportunities. So that shifts to the next question. How does this linguistic shift reveal who has power to frame narratives about American education? So I really looked at it. Changing the word dropout to pushout shifts the focus of blame. So when we say dropout, it sounds like the student chose to leave the school, putting responsibility on the individual. But when we say pushout, it shows that schools and systems play a role in forcing students out, especially through unfair disciplines and lack of support. This change in language reveals who has the power to define the problem. The school systems, teachers, policymakers often control the narrative to protect themselves, but then when you look at the term pushout, it challenges that by exposing how institutions, not just students, are responsible for inequality. Using pushout acknowledges that students are being pushed out of classrooms as a result of external factors like systematic oppression and subordination, and black girls have access to achievement and opportunity, as it will show ways that they are impacted by external factors. Rather than making the individual reason for leaving school, push-out focuses on how the individual was forced to leave as a result of systematic inequalities. So another quote I found that I thought really represented how black girls are treated in school and what it looks like. So this quote says by McCluskey, "These sources confirm them, not simply as historical equivalents of the expectational women, but as part of an informal but visible sisterhood of purpose, embracing shared ideals and motives." So this quote shows that black women like Lainey Bethune, Brown, and Burroughs took control of their own education by creating schools that centered black excellence and leadership instead of letting white systems define them as inferior. They reclaimed the story of who belongs and what success means, challenging the dropout narrative with their own push-out response. So this brings us to shifts focus to the simulation we did. So it says, how did your performance in the simulation challenge or support educational policies and practice that may lead to over-policing and pushing out of black girls from schools? So my goal for education as a future educator is democratic equality, meaning everyone has a fair chance to learn and succeed, no matter who they are and what they look like. That being that this is my main priority when it comes to education, the situation that went on in the simulation challenged these exact ideals of democratic education and democratic equality. So I found the quote from Bells and Hooks that I really liked. It says, "Now more than ever before in our nation, we need educators to make school places where the conditions for democratic consciousness can be established and flourish." This quote by Bells and Hooks is exactly what we need to implement in the schools, and it's actually the complete opposite of what Miss Margaret did in the simulation. Tanisha was simply a little out of focus in Miss Margaret's class, like many children typically are, but Miss Margaret decided to call Tanisha out for her lack of focus, which then called for Tanisha to reply by standing up for herself. So Tanisha pushed back and used the exact words, "I am listening, we went over this last week, and you don't have to come for me like that in front of everyone." And then under her breath, she added, "You're boring us all to death anyway." This was a response that could have come out of any student's mouth, but due to the color of Tanisha's skin, Miss Margaret took it as Tanisha being aggressive and decided to call the dean, which then led to Tanisha being put in handcuffs. My performance in the simulation challenged educational practices that led to the over-policing and push-out of Black girls because I tried to recognize Tanisha's perspective and respond in a way that supported her right to be heard. In the simulation, Miss Margaret interpreted Tanisha's normal student behavior, being slightly out of focus and standing up for herself, as aggressive. And that's exactly where the problem lied. So I actually saw an example in the film Push Out that I think to challenge the biases Miss Margaret should have done. A teacher in Push Out decided to give one of her students a journal. So instead of talking back when she felt upset or angry, she gave her the journal. And then she was able to put all of her thoughts into that, and it really helped calm her down. So instead of Miss Margaret overreacting, and Tanisha as well, Miss Margaret could have simply took Tanisha's response, handed her a journal, and she could have put her ideas there. Or she could have chosen to go take a walk outside and come back when she's ready. And that really would have challenged the biases. But instead, Miss Margaret really did end up agreeing with the biases by dragging her out of the classroom and putting her in restraints. It put Tanisha in a terribly uncomfortable situation. So lastly, my last question is, how has this experience shown you better ways to educate, whether as an educator or to support students? And what are some ways this experience has encouraged your future career as an educator? So, in my opinion, this experience showed me the importance of creating a learning environment that centers equality and understanding. I realized that as an educator, it's not enough to just enforce rules and follow the standard procedures that the institutions give you. I need to actively listen to my students and recognize how systematic biases may affect them, and then adapt my teaching strategies to ensure that every student in my classroom feels seen and capable of success. So, for example, observing the ways Black girls can be over-policed or pushed out of schools highlighted the need to respond to behavior with guidance and care rather than punishment, promoting restorative practices and constructive communication instead. This experience really has encouraged my future career as an educator by reinforcing my commitment to democratic equality in education and in my classroom especially. I am motivated to create classrooms where every student is seen and heard and feels that they are being represented, and I really think that is the only way students can thrive, when they feel that they are safe and represented. So thank you, and this is my works cited. Thank you.